On December 8, 1963, 19-year-old Frank Sinatra Jr. was following in his father's footsteps and preparing to sing on stage at a casino. The children of legendary singer Frank Sinatra would all end up in show business, and that wasn't surprising. Being the namesake of a legend meant Frank Jr. would spend most of his time in clubs and studios surrounded by other industry greats. It also meant that desperate criminals would see him as a possible payday. Before he even had the chance to perform that day, Frank Jr. was taken from his hotel room and held for 54 hours while his captors demanded money for his release. This is Monsters. "1963 was another successful year for the Sinatra family. Not only had the patriarch Frank released 2 hit albums in the form of The Concert Sinatra and Sinatra's Sinatra, but 2 of his children, Nancy and Frank Jr., were also gearing up to start their own music careers. One person who was not having so much luck was a former classmate of Nancy's named Barry Keenan. Despite having found success as the youngest member of the Los Angeles Stock Exchange when he was still just 21 years old, a subsequent car accident had left him penniless and addicted to painkillers. In desperate need of money to fund his ever-worsening habit, Barry came up with the initial kernel of a plan that would hopefully see him get back on his feet. The only problem was the plan involved kidnapping someone and then using the situation to blackmail their family for ransom money. Sure, it may have seemed like an extreme option for any reasonably minded person when there were plenty of other ways out there to make some cash, especially for a man who was as skilled as Barry was in the business world, but addiction can do strange things to the mind, and anyway, it wasn't like he planned to outright steal the ransom. No, as far as he told himself at least, he was going to invest it and then pay the initial sum back in full at a later date. In that sense, then, there really was no stealing involved. All he was really taking on was a loan of sorts. The only question remaining was who he would target, a thought process that initially led the struggling young man to consider going after Bob Hope's son, Tony. After realizing Bob was out of the country entertaining American troops taking part in the Vietnam War, he decided against that path as he felt it wouldn't be very American. Instead, what he needed was someone closer to home, someone who, in his own words, had parents that were tough and could handle a few hours of worrying about their kids. That's when he came upon the idea of targeting the Sinatra family. Of course, it wouldn't be his old classmate Nancy he'd go after, though. No, that would be far too obvious. Instead, Barry convinced another high school friend named Joe Amsler, as well as his mother's former boyfriend, John Irwin, to help him work out the kinks in his plan to kidnap Frank Jr. Unfortunately, however, as the trio would soon learn, none of them were exactly master criminals. In fact, they were a lot closer to the bumbling kidnappers from Fargo than they were the Symbionese Liberation Army who had once successfully indoctrinated Patty Hearst. That would become increasingly apparent during their early attempts to enact their plan, a plan that amounted to following Frank Jr. around as he was touring Arizona performing shows. Then once he was off stage and relaxing in his dressing room, bursting in and carrying him away at gunpoint. Needless to say, this proved to be easier said than done because during the first show where they saw the singer in Phoenix, Barry, the ringleader behind the whole plan, got cold feet once he realized his fingerprints were on the phone he'd been practicing making ransom calls from. Yes, while holed up in a nearby guest house, the former day trader had decided to test out his abilities in sounding threatening over the phone. The only problem was, once he realized he wasn't wearing gloves, he'd called the phone company to come in and set up a replacement line. When they did that, he let them take the original handset away with them before he had a chance to wipe it down, leaving his fingerprints readily available for anyone to find should they investigate hard enough. So, spooked, Barry called the whole thing off and instead brought someone else into the fold to help the trio out. That ended up being his girlfriend, Pam, a young woman from a rich family who could help fund further trips for them. That eventually led to a second attempt taking place on November 2nd, 1963, a date that might sound familiar because it was the same day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That's right, with the leader of the nation being shot dead in Dallas that afternoon, the country was on higher alert than ever before, and so the team of hapless criminals had no choice but to pull the plug on the operation once again. That wouldn't deter them from trying a third time, though. No, a few weeks later, after Frank Jr. had briefly returned home to his apartment in Los Angeles, the trio, minus Pam, all decided to break into his laundry room and lay there and wait for him. Sadly for them, though, as they were about to do just that, a neighbor spotted them in the act. When the neighbor asked what they were doing, and the only flimsy excuse they could come up with on the spot was to say they were making a delivery, she threatened to call the cops should they not leave immediately. So they fled the scene and set about making plans for a fourth attempt on December 8th, the very day Frank Jr. would return to touring at Harrah's Club Lodge in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. That time, they weren't going to let anything as trivial as a set of rogue fingerprints, an eyewitness, or a national tragedy stop them. They all instinctively realized this was their last chance, so they made sure they had everything in place ahead of time. Sure, it was only Barry and Joe there in person now, and they had managed to make things harder for themselves right off the bat by blowing the $1,800 Pam had given them ahead of time while waiting around on the casino floor. But that didn't matter because soon they would have a wealth of money coming in from the Sinatra family. All they had to do was find Frank Jr.'s room. Something they did by running around the hotel area of the casino until they found the correct room number, then knocking on the door at around 9 p.m., claiming they had a package for him. Of course, even that didn't go as planned, though, because once old Blue Eye's son answered and the kidnappers barged inside, they found John Foss, the trumpet player of the band, also there. Obviously, that presented a problem, as he was an eyewitness to what the kidnappers had planned. That was why, in the hopes of scaring him into staying quiet, Barry attempted to pull a gun out of his pocket. But when he did, the hammer got stuck, causing him to fumble and briefly lose control of the situation. Desperate to recover, he shouted, quote, "Okay, this is a robbery. Where's your wallet?" Then he instructed Joe to tie up John Foss and blindfold him. Sure, the blindfolding meant little by then, as the trumpet player had seen both of their faces, but Barry and Joe were likely panicking, so everything they were doing was out of instinct and not careful thought. It was that very panicked attitude that also led the ringleader to mistakenly call Joe by his real name as they were wrapping masking tape around the mouth of Frank Jr. He then dragged him outside where he threw him into the trunk of a getaway car. Yes, the kidnapping may have been messy, but the group of criminals had what they came for. Well, that was until they were driving away and Barry realized he'd left his gun in the dressing room, something that forced them to turn around and go back for it. Once they had retrieved the gun, though, things were finally good. After all, they had Frank Sinatra Jr. in their captivity and, after loading him up with sleeping pills and booze, they would finally be able to drive him the 12-hour journey towards their safe house in Los Angeles without any further incident. At least that was what they thought. Unfortunately for the worst criminals in existence, though, their technique at tying up John Foss had not been so great. Because of that, it hadn't taken him long to free himself and call the police. So, with the cops now on the lookout for the two men who were clearly identified by the trumpet player, the heat was on. That led to a number of roadblocks being set up across the state of Nevada. In a rare moment of luck, however, Barry and Joe were able to avoid capture when Barry was somehow able to bluff his way out of the situation when they were stopped at one of those roadblocks. Apparently, they weren't entirely inept as a group of kidnappers, and that was how, after a 400-mile trip, they arrived safely in LA on December 10th, where Barry immediately got in contact with John Irwin and told him to report to their hideout. As Barry and Joe were waiting for John to arrive, further panic began to draw upon Barry when he realized he'd forgotten to check out of their casino hotel room before they had left, and as a result of that, they still had a $1,089 bill waiting to be paid under their names. That wasn't even the worst of it, though, because inside that same hotel room, they'd also left behind wigs and fake mustaches they'd originally planned to wear during the abduction but had forgotten to do so in the heat of the moment. Really, to leave such evidence behind would be tantamount to handing themselves over to the police, so in order to remedy the situation, Barry and his girlfriend Pam drove back to Lake Tahoe where, upon arriving at the casino hotel, they found FBI agents already there investigating the scene. Of course, none of those agents suspected the pair had anything to do with what had just taken place. After all, who would be stupid enough to return to the scene of the crime so quickly? And that was what allowed them to go back to their room, collect the disguises they'd left behind, then pay their bill, all before setting off for Los Angeles once more. But things weren't going particularly well back there either because, at least initially, Frank Sinatra Jr. had refused to give over his father's phone number when asked for it by John Irwin. Rather than contact him directly then, John called the Maples Hotel in Reno where they knew old Blue Eyes was now located and told them to let the singer know they wanted to speak to him. It wasn't exactly the smoothest way to begin negotiations, and it led to another big blunder for the gang as, once they were offered $1 million in exchange for handing the boy over safe and sound, John replied, quote, "Well, we don't need $1 million. We're asking for $240,000. Yep. For some reason, the gang were demanding only a quarter of what was initially being offered. Needless to say, Sinatra quickly agreed to their demands, and the next morning he traveled to a Chevron station in Carson City as per the kidnapper's instructions. Once there, he received another call, this time from Barry as he and Pam had by that point returned to the safe house in LA. It was during that call that Barry informed Frank Sr. to place the cash inside a suitcase and have it dropped off the following day at a spot located between two school buses parked at a Texaco station on Sepulveda Boulevard in Los Angeles. Why there? Well, it was close enough to where the trio were hiding out that they felt they could get to the location, get the money, and then get away quickly without being seen. What they hadn't counted on, though, was that the FBI would be there waiting for them at the pickup point. So when Barry and Joe arrived to collect the briefcase, 3 cars immediately rolled up filled with uniformed officers all waiting to question them. Even then, that wasn't the end of their plan because, correctly guessing that the FBI wouldn't make an actual move until they knew Frank Jr. was safe, Barry simply picked up the briefcase, tossed it in his car, then instructed his co-conspirator to drive off. Yes, as long as they still had their ace in the hole, the trio were in the clear. It's just a shame that, as Barry and Joe were collecting the ransom money, back at the safe house, John was getting cold feet over the whole situation. Enough to where he decided to drive his captive to Mulholland Drive, then let him go in the hopes that would free him from any culpability in the crime. In the end, all that did was ensure he'd be caught sooner rather than later. That was because, after wandering around the area for several miles, Frank Jr. flagged down a car driven by a private security guard who was able to take him to his mother's house in Bel Air. Once there, he was able to relay the entire situation to authorities, including what they looked like, what at least one of their names were, and the general area of the safe house he'd been kept in. Obviously, it didn't take long for the FBI to track down the exact location of the safe house, and when they did, they found Barry and Joe there with the entirety of the ransom money on their persons. As for John Irwin, though, well, he'd already been caught by that point because, once he cracked under the pressure and confessed to his brother about his involvement in the crime, that same brother called the authorities and turned him in. With all 3 men now in custody, it was a case of putting them on trial as quickly as possible. That said, the trial that followed would prove to be just as bizarre as the kidnapping itself. When trying to explain his actions to the court, Barry Keenan argued that he'd only done what he did because he wanted to bring the Sinatras closer together, all while protecting himself from financial ruin. As he saw it, such a scare would no doubt cause the family to appreciate each other more. And that wasn't the only out-there statement that he gave during the 4-week trial either. At one point, Barry claimed Dean Torrance, one half of popular music duo at the time Jan and Dean, had actually given him $500 in order to help him out with his plan as he considered it an investment which would pay dividends once the ransom was received. Then, if that wasn't enough, there was also the rumor Barry started that suggested Frank Jr. had come up with the whole abduction plan himself in the first place as a publicity stunt. What evidence did he have that such a claim was true? Well, as Frank Jr. would later admit when called to the stand, he'd at one point told his captors, quote, "I hope you guys get away with this." Sure, it wasn't exactly a smoking gun, and Barry would later recant that part of the story entirely. Still, it didn't stop such stories from following the Sinatra son around for the rest of his life. It also didn't do anything to keep the trio from being convicted either, as, after a month passed, the judge decided to hand down life sentences plus 75 years to both Barry and Joe, as well as a single 75-year sentence to John. Not that any of them would remain behind bars for that long, though. No, following a series of successful appeals, each person's stay behind bars would be reduced to 25 years after a psychiatric evaluation deemed Barry Keenan in particular to be both legally and mentally insane at the time of the crime. How was that determined? Well, during his evaluation, it came to light that the ringleader regularly heard voices which he believed to be coming from God. Voices that told him that kidnapping the child of a famous person was the only way to make the kind of money he needed in order to succeed as part of the American dream. That had been an issue Barry had been dealing with for quite some time, and it was one that he claimed ran in his family. It was thought it might even be part of the reason he so easily fell into addiction and financial ruin following his accident. Obviously, with such an underlying psychiatric issue, it meant he could not be held responsible for his actions in the same way a regular mentally sane person could. And given the fact no one was actually hurt during the kidnapping, it made it easier for a judge to later reduce the sentences of all three men as a result. But even that new 25-year period wouldn't mark the length of their stays behind bars because, after only 3.5 years, both Joe Amsler and John Irwin would be released on account of good behavior. Only a year after that, the same would happen to Barry Keenan too. What would they do with their newfound freedom? Well, as far as John was concerned, he'd live a mostly quiet life under the radar, probably on account of him not wanting to draw any more attention at that point. When it came to Joe, things would mostly play out the same as he worked as a farmhand and Hollywood stunt double all the way up until his death in 2006. As for Barry, though, he had no intentions of disappearing into the night so easily. Now back on his feet somewhat, he was able to use his prior skills in business to turn himself into a true titan of industry, a real estate developer who, come the 1980s, was worth over $17 million. But that wasn't all, because on top of that, he also made a further $1.5 million from Columbia Pictures in 1999 after selling the rights to his story. Although production of that movie would initially be delayed after Frank Sinatra Jr. tried to file a lawsuit arguing California law forbade felons from profiting financially from the stories of their crimes. In the end, though, the lawsuit would be thrown out on appeal, and the film Stealing Sinatra was released in 2003 with a cast that included David Arquette and William H. Macy. That said, it wasn't all good luck and prosperousness for Barry following his release from prison. No, his addiction issues would continue to haunt him throughout the subsequent decades, with that leading him to eventually joining a 12-step program and using his positive experience there to help others by building new treatment centers, psychiatric hospitals, and shelters throughout the Los Angeles area. Really then, perhaps the lesson he should have learned from everything is that he was a far more skilled businessman than he was a kidnapper, and maybe he should have been focusing on that as a way to get ahead right from the start. But the past can't be changed, and while it's the events of 1963 that will go on to define the three criminals involved, it should always be remembered that for all their flaws, they were far more than one incident. Each of them was and is a complex individual just struggling to get by in life. And for that reason alone, even if they did make their fair share of mistakes, they deserve some empathy from us all. And maybe some lessons on how to not get immediately caught when trying to commit a major crime. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases in criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.